national perspective, you'll then hear from John Keller, the Principal Deputy Chief of the Department's Public Integrity Section. And finally, you'll hear remarks from Akil Davis, the Special Agent in charge for the FBI's Phoenix Field Office. I'll summarize this introduction in Spanish for the benefit of any Spanish language media. Reunimos hoy para discutir la estrategia del Departamento de Justicia por la protección de oficiales y otros servidores públicos en la administración de elecciones. Estos empleados son los primeros respondedores de la democracia y sigamos en la investigación y imputación de las personas que hagan estas amenazas. We last spoke to the press here in Arizona about election threats in August of 2023 in announcing the sentencing in one case. That was Mark Reese, an Iowa man who received a sentence of 30 months for threatening both a county and a state official. He self-surrendered today in Arkansas. And we also announced pleas in 2 other cases. We'll give the update on those 2 cases first. The first of those pleas was from James Clark, a Massachusetts man who threatened then Secretary of State Katie Hobbs in February 2021 by threatening to detonate an explosive device, leading to a partial evacuation of the executive tower. Clark also conducted online searches a few days later involving the Boston Marathon bombing. He was sentenced earlier this month to 42 months imprisonment. The second plea we announced last August was from Joshua Russell of Ohio. Mr. Russell made 3 phone calls to the office of then Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, threatening to put her in the ground or in a grave. The first threat was on August 2nd, 2022, which you know to be primary day, and the final threat, in which Mr. Russell called from a different phone number, was shortly after the general election in November. Mr. Russell was charged a few months later in December of 2022. When agents arrived at his residence, he barricaded himself inside for a short time and was belligerent with law enforcement. He was sentenced today to 30 months imprisonment and remanded immediately into custody by the sentencing judge. Now, we've also got some newer cases charged. Last month, an Arizona grand jury charged Brian Jerry Ogstad with sending threatening messages from Alabama to Arizona. The messages, over a course of days, were sent on and shortly after the primary election in August 2022 via direct message services on Instagram to the Maricopa County Elections Department. One of the threats, as alleged in the indictment, included the following language: "Everyone knows you are cheats and frauds, and in so doing, in relation to elections, you have committed treason. Bang." Also last month, our colleagues in the Southern District of California charged William Hyde, a resident of San Diego, with leaving a threatening voicemail on the personal cell phone of an election official with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office following the canvass of the 2022 general election. Our thanks to U.S. Attorney Tara McGrath and her team in San Diego for helping protect Arizona officials. So let's talk about some trends. We've now got 7 federal cases, including Frederick Goltz, convicted in Texas, and Walter Hornstra, currently pending charges in Missouri, in which outsiders threatened our fellow Arizonans. So what does this tell us? First, there is no constitutional right to vigilantism. There is a common denominator in many of these cases: election denialists announcing an intent to violently punish those who believe they have wronged them, often with a threat of arrests leading to executions for treason. Let these cases be a lesson not to take or attempt to take the rule of law into one's own hands. Second, not all nasty or cruel emails, direct messages, and phone calls are what we call true threats. Criminalizing a communication under federal law requires a serious expression that a speaker means to commit an act of violence. This means that not all sharp comments are crimes, and importantly, it also means that can often take additional context for us, the FBI agents involved, and the prosecutors to establish the speaker's understanding and the recipient's reaction. Third, also importantly, this is an evolving standard. We continue to look at recent court decisions to evaluate and reevaluate threat complaints. Deterring election threats remains a key focus of Attorney General Merrick Garland and Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, and we will continue to vindicate the rights of officials who receive these communications. Fourth, we need to figure out the impact of all these prosecutions. Given that most of these threats seem to arise around the election and tabulation cycle, I expect we won't really have an anecdotal sense of the deterrent value until our July 30th primary election, but we do have some positive metrics in terms of sentences imposed to date. We also see some important sharing of responsibilities by our state and local prosecutors because we're all in this together. In the last year, prosecutors at the state attorney general's office and also at Pima and Navajo counties have each convicted a defendant who threatened an election official or an elected official who has opined about elections. This is a welcome development, and there's more than enough work to go around. And this leads me to my final point. We're doing pretty well here in Arizona working together. The presidential preference election went forward last week and highlighted the professionalism of our poll workers. The Arizona Republic called it a near perfect election day, and I can tell you from personal experience that the county election staff at Burton Barr Library last Tuesday were friendly and knowledgeable and efficient. On a more general level, the Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center, or ACTIC, continues its great efforts in coordinating regular updates among county, state, and federal officials and representatives. Our district election officer here at the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI's designated agent regularly liaise with their counterparts at the Secretary of State and the various county election departments. Non-governmental organizations, like All Voting is Local, engage in important advocacy work, and the State Bar of Arizona is equally engaged with plans next month for a day-long symposium for lawyers involved in election work. And this takes us back to the whole of government approach, and that's really a community-wide approach. Prosecution is a key tool in deterring true threats, perhaps the most important tool, and when we level charges consistently and transparently, we bolster and safeguard the rule of law. But prosecution isn't the only tool to protect democracy in Arizona. We as prosecutors are determined to get out of the courthouse and into the communities that surround it, and we need that same commitment from community leaders. From those leaders and elders and influencers, we need an increased focus on civic education and civil dialogue to intervene with the vigilantes who would threaten our democracy. Thank you, and I'll now turn it over to my colleague, John Keller, from the Public Integrity section.
Good afternoon. As U.S. Attorney Restaino just said, my name is John Keller. I lead the day-to-day efforts of the Justice Department's Election Threats Task Force and serve as the Principal Deputy Chief for the Public Integrity section in Washington, D.C. Thank you, United States Attorney Restaino and FBI Special Agent in Charge Davis, for your outstanding leadership in this case and others here in Arizona. Your offices have been incredible partners in this and a number of other threat investigations and prosecutions involving victims from the election community right here. I also want to thank the National Security Division and the prosecutors that handled the Russell case today, Sean Loki and Tanya Sinanayaka, for their excellent work on this matter. This group of Arizona election officials, like election officials across the country, has faced an onslaught of unfounded hostility for nothing more than dutifully and reliably doing their jobs. Attacks on these officials are attacks on the very foundation of our democracy, our elections. Today's sentencing is an outstanding example of ongoing work being done in Arizona and across the country by the Election Threats Task Force in partnership with the United States Attorney's Offices, FBI, and other state, local, and federal law enforcement partners. In response to widespread reports of threats during and following the 2020 election cycle, Attorney General Garland and Deputy Attorney General Monaco formed the Election Threats Task Force to ensure investigation and prosecution of any criminal threat to election officials or their staff. The department will not tolerate any unlawful efforts to intimidate or harm the thousands of civil servants who toil day in and day out, one election cycle to the next, to ensure that every qualified individual has the opportunity to exercise their most fundamental right, the right to vote. This country was founded not only on the premise of free and fair elections, but also on the idea that public scrutiny of government authority is not only desirable, it is necessary. Debate on public issues should be robust and may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government officials. But death threats are not debate. Death threats do not contribute to the marketplace of ideas. Death threats are not First Amendment protected speech. Death threats and any threats of violence are condemnable criminal acts, and they will be met with the full force of the Department of Justice. While the vast majority of communications reported to the task force have not met the legal definition of a true threat, every single communication is thoroughly reviewed and assessed, and where a potential true threat is identified, the task force and our partners aggressively investigate these matters. But because so much of the hostility does not cross the line into criminal threats, prosecution alone is not the answer. We must do better as a society. The normalization of personal threats and attacks on government officials and their families is contributing to an election environment in which people are committing previously unthinkable crimes. And the violence is not just hypothetical. In New Mexico, we saw a child awakened from her sleep, telling her mother that a spider was crawling on her face, when in reality it was debris falling from bullets flying through her bedroom. Election officials and their families are not villains. Throughout most of our history, they have been unsung heroes, largely anonymous figures doing the essential work of preparing for and administering our elections. This new era in which the election community is scapegoated, targeted, and attacked is unconscionable. And in addition to the obvious toll taken on individual victims, risks depleting the ranks of experienced election officials vital to the effective administration of our elections. The department is grateful to our state and local law enforcement partners who remain first responders for any acts or threats of violence across the country. We continue to coordinate closely with those offices and with state and local prosecutors. The task force was not formed to substitute for these state and local authorities. We have stepped in to supplement limited resources in some of these jurisdictions to ensure that every single actionable threat to the election community is investigated and prosecuted where the facts and the law support criminal charges. The task force has opened dozens of threats investigations nationwide. We have charged roughly 20 defendants for engaging in threats to the election community. To date, these charges have resulted in 13 convictions, including Mr. Russell, who was sentenced today. 10 defendants have been sentenced. 7 have received sentences between 1.5 years and 3.5 years in prison, signaling how seriously the federal courts are taking this conduct. In addition to investigations and prosecutions, the task force is regularly engaged with state, local, and national organizations of election officials, meeting with or presenting to these groups on a nearly weekly basis, providing updates on the department's work, and also providing information on alternative resources where prosecution is not possible. But our work is not done. Our efforts will not wane. The department will continue to vigorously pursue anyone who criminally threatens or targets the election community. This behavior is insidious, with potentially grave consequences for individual victims and for the institution of election administration as a whole. These threats must stop. The public must know any criminal threats to the election community will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Turn things over now to Special Agent in Charge Davis.
Good afternoon. My name is Akil Davis. I'm the Special Agent in Charge of the FBI Phoenix Division, which covers the entire state of Arizona. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to talk about the FBI's role in securing elections. Citizens should know that the FBI collaborates across all our investigative programs to safeguard elections and address a broad range of threats such as cybercrime, foreign influence crime, and domestic terrorism. For decades, the FBI has worked with the Department of Justice Public Integrity Section, coordinating strategies with our election security partners to safeguard elections. The FBI investigates allegations of voter fraud, voter and ballot fraud, campaign finance crimes, civil rights violations, and specifically threats targeting election workers. In fact, in 2021, as you've heard already, we established, along with the Department of Justice, the Election Threats Task Force. You've heard a lot of the successes we've had with that task force. This task force was created following the 2020 U.S. election. Election security is and will continue to be one of the FBI's highest national security priorities. Arizonans have a right to expect free and fair elections. While responsibility to ensure the fair election process lies with our state and local counterparts, I want to stress that the FBI takes all allegations seriously, all allegations of election-related violations of federal law seriously. It is vital that the FBI, our law enforcement election partners, and the public work together to protect our communities, to protect the vote. See something, say something may be a slogan from years past, but it definitely applies here. If anyone sees or hears anything that makes them uncomfortable, they are urged to please call their local law enforcement officials or the FBI. I'd like to conclude with this as it relates to a free and fair election and those public servants across Arizona who work to ensure it. The FBI takes all threats of violence seriously, and we remain vigilant in our efforts to detect and assess possible threats to the election. It cannot be overstated. The work of election officials, their staffs, and volunteers is essential to our democracy, and any threat to these public servants is completely unacceptable. Thank you again for your time today.
All right, thanks to Zach Davis and Chief Keller. We can take questions related to the department's efforts to combat election threats, if any. Sir?
Joe Dana with 12 News. Can you comment on the role of misinformation as it relates to motivating some of these that have already been prosecuted, particularly misinformation from current elected officials or from a foreign actor like Russia putting information on social media?
So I'm going to speak more towards the former, just the general misinformation that is out there. Look, this is what some of the defendants say during their allocutions, right? That they were misled in certain ways. It certainly would be good for these defendants in their road towards being productive members of society in the future to help out those that are giving them misinformation. For us, this comes down to that civic education and the civil dialogue. We look to you to report the facts. We look to the community to call out their friends and neighbors who are going down the rabbit hole of misinformation to help people not fall victim to it. Let me see if anyone else has points to make on that. Anything else?
Yes, I wanted to ask Mr. Keller a question. Yeah, I think you were referring to in some of your comments the effects of these threats, and it seemed like you were saying that they're having trouble getting people these threats are making it hard for people to work in election offices, and it also seems to me like you're scaring away your talent, like your institutional knowledge there. Do you think there's any way to win all of that back? I mean, is this just something that's washing over us now, and the best we can hope is to keep people's expectations as they are now?
So, in response to the first part of your question, there has been a reported impact statistically on the election community. We are seeing resignations from election officials across the country, and what they're reporting is that oftentimes the reason that they are leaving the role is because of the threats and the harassment that they and their colleagues and sometimes their families face. Now, that said, I don't want to overstate the impact. I've seen incredible resilience in the election community, and a lot of election officials are proudly staying put and insisting that they will not be intimidated from doing their jobs. And so I think on the positive side, we have that to look toward, and I think that reflects the mentality of the majority of election officials out there. And so hopefully the negative impact from this kind of conduct is limited in the future.
Other questions?
Could you run down the two new charges that you mentioned at the beginning briefly? Well, at least you mentioned two more recent ones from, I think, California and another southern state.
Correct. And again, these are pending charges. I'm not going to talk much about them openly. We do have, the department has done press releases within the last month on each of these. It's Brian Jerry Oxtad threatening communications from Alabama to Arizona in relation to the Maricopa County Elections Department. He has been released pending trial, and trial is pending in that case. The Southern District of California case was a resident of San Diego who calls an Arizona election official, again, charged out in San Diego in federal court there, also pending trial. Sir.
Jim McClellan, Arizona Mirror. There's a whole industry now that profits off pushing these kind of misinformation that leads a lot of people to end up being incited to violence or having high emotions. You talked a little bit about how the department is reacting to these threats that are being increased, that are coming in. What is the department doing proactively ahead of 2024 to get ahead of this continuing to happen. I mean, these industries that push these narratives are clearly not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, so I'll start on this and see if anyone else wants to chime in as well. Certainly, the department continues to engage with the state and local partners to try to get a sense of what the landscape is and what the continuing threats are. And this is where ACTIC, the Counterterrorism Information Center, is helpful. This is where I imagine Zach Davis can talk about his analysts that are out there that are able to get a better sense of the trends that we are seeing. And part of that is being proactive and understanding what's going on. To the extent we're talking about the industry and the platforms that enable this, we're not likely to be going after the platforms themselves that are enabling the speech to take place. That's not the way we're going to combat disinformation through a use of the criminal justice system in a way that inspires confidence. But it does strike me that we should be engaging with some of those platforms. We've done this in other areas of the criminal law to get a better sense of those that provide the platform for the speech. And finally, beyond that, we continue to listen to the complaints that come in from the election community. It's the election community that are not just the first responders, but the ones that have the knowledge of the evolving threats, and we will continue to listen to them. Let me first see if Zach Davis has anything to add on FBI resources and analysts.
Thank you, Gary. I would only like to add that Mr. Restaino just said about the FBI's analytic capability. It's robust, and we have surged significant resources to our analytic capability since 2020. So we have representatives at the State Fusion Center, the ACTIC, as you've heard before, but we also have dedicated analysts in Southern Arizona and Northern Arizona. So we cover the entire state, scrubbing the internet with our social media teams, looking for these threats and assessing them. So that's really how we kind of go down that hole of determining, are these foreign influence threats, are these domestic threats, or kind of what's the impetus driving some of these threats to try to control some of these narratives. It's really our intelligence capabilities that gets us a seat at the table. Yeah.
I had a follow-up on that. What does your active room look like now during an election live, and how has that changed since 2020? How are you approaching it differently, like live threats?
It looks very similar to 2020, like a command post and any, our fans over at CBS love the FBI these days, so just watch any of those shows for what a command post looks like. What has changed is the skill set of the folks operating that command post. So computer scientists, data analysts, and then along with our normal intelligence cadre, and a whole host of FBI special agent cadre are there. But it's a true fusion center, so all state, local, and federal counterparts are help operating that to ensure a safe election.
So that's the boots on the ground perspective from the FBI and what we're seeing in Arizona. You know, the public integrity section has a large national platform and a real good engagement strategy. And I want to see if Chief Keller has anything to add to that prior question as well.
So I mentioned this briefly in my remarks, but we have an election community liaison who is actually going out on essentially a weekly basis now to election officials throughout the country, meeting with them, hearing what they're seeing on the ground, responding to some of the issues that they're dealing with, and also updating them on what we're doing at the task force and providing them contact information to the extent that they don't have it. I mean, I think one of the most important things that we want to ensure that all election officials have going into 2024 is the contact information for the local FBI election crime coordinator in their jurisdiction, so that they know, A, that there is a federal resource available to them as maybe not a first responder, because we want to leave that public safety response largely to state and local law enforcement, but as a second responder to assess the communication or incident for potential criminality and investigation and prosecution. I would also note that in preparation for the 2024 election cycle with the FBI and other federal agencies, Public Integrity Section Election Crimes Branch has been running tabletop exercises where in real time we're going through scenario-based situations and ensuring that nationally our Department of Homeland Security offices, our FBI offices, and even election officials themselves have a sense of how to respond, how to report, and what to expect.
And if I can just give one final Arizona shout out on this one. So our district election officer, Sean Loki, who's prosecuting the cases that you heard about today, taught a segment on precisely this at our National Advocacy Center. Some of the best practices that we have unfortunately had to develop here in Arizona to share with the rest of the community. And so we don't really want to be a leader in this space, but we are, and we're out there engaging. Other questions?
How does Arizona compare then to other states in terms of these threats to election workers and concerns about election integrity and stuff?
Sure. I mean, you've heard the numbers. We got 7 cases here out of these 18 or so that have been charged. That's a lot. We unfortunately are a leader in that, and you know the trend as well. These are outsiders calling in to Arizona. We expect that we are going to remain in the crosshairs, so to speak, of these threats, given that Arizona will remain a battleground state, and so we'll continue to be vigilant on that. In the back?
Special Agent Keller, this is probably for you. You mentioned other remedies that, other than prosecution, that you're talking to local officials about. Can you elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, so given the true threat standard that U.S. Attorney Restaino mentioned, there is a large swath of this hostility in these communications that unfortunately are not criminally actionable. That doesn't mean that they should be condoned, but they're not going to be criminalized. And so in those instances, we're working with election officials to connect them with nonprofit agencies that are kind of adjacent to the election space that help officials with things like seeking civil process, like temporary restraining orders, if they have a repeat person who is engaging in harassment but maybe hasn't crossed the line into criminal threats. There are also cyber and physical security assessments that DHS will do for any election official, election office across the country that will come out physically, inspect the office, run through the cyber systems, and recommend best practices or enhancements. And then the last thing we've done is primarily is to connect them with federal agencies that are responsible for funding in this area. So Help America Vote Act funds, or the Election Assistance Commission, which administers some of these funds. Because one thing we've consistently heard from the community is that they need more funding to meet this new challenge of hostility in the community.
Let me just give one follow-up to that, sort of from an Arizona perspective. You know, people that are engaging in these types of communications, even if not criminal in nature, are by definition cyberbullies. And so cyberbullies might be people who are, from a local perspective, involved in other potential local crime. This is where this whole of government approach fits in. This is where making sure that federal authorities are engaging with state and local counterparts to make sure that we are sharing intel on people who might pose threats or disruptions, even if their interstate communications don't rise to the level of a federal crime. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Sir, in the back.
En español, por favor.
Sí, claro.
Dice, ¿qué tan grave es las amenazas ahora en las elecciones de lo que está hablando, señor? En español.
Bueno, es muy grave, decimos nosotros, porque ahora tenemos 7 casos a través de Arizona. En el pasado tuvimos 0. Entonces, de 0 hasta 7 es muchísimo. Y el problema es que los oficiales y los trabajadores realmente tal vez pierden confianza y no van a las urnas para aportar las elecciones. Entonces, es una crisis en tener las personas de trabajar con confianza, y nuestra meta, supongamos en es de tener imputaciones contra las personas que están amenazando nuestros héroes de elecciones. One more question? Sir.
I know this is not necessarily your job, but I'm asking you if you'd like to comment any of that to this idea that just last week we had some elected officials once again float some what would be considered conspiracies that the local county reporter here said represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the elections. And